Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we're talking about Joe Biden's approval ratings. We're talking about the latest in the negotiations around the Iran nuclear deal. And we have an update on civilian casualties in the Yemen. First of all, things are not looking good for the self-proclaimed leaders of the free world. In the United States, nearly 60% of adults disapprove of Joe Biden's work since assuming the Oval Office. He can be thankful, though, that it's not as bad as his major ally across the Atlantic, Boris Johnson, who's polling at less than 25%. Firstly, Prashant, 1 year into the term, it's obviously not good news for Biden. Who is voting or who is polling for him and who is against?
Right, Siddhant. So you think that coming after Donald Trump, it should have been a cakewalk for Joe Biden, but that's clearly not the case. And if you look at, it's not just one poll, by the way, because it's polls conducted by a variety of organizations. And there's a pattern of polling which has shown that Biden's approval ratings are pretty poor. It's a bit of an understatement, maybe. And it's important to note, of course, that one of the key aspects many experts have pointed out is that there is approval and there's disapproval, and there's also strongly approve and strongly disapprove.
Right.
So the actual numbers of people who strongly approve of Biden's performance are even lower, whereas the strongly disapprove numbers are pretty high. And this actually shows that even Biden's core base, which is the Democratic voters across the country, even they're not very enthusiastic about what his performance has been. And this is actually pretty understandable if you look at the larger arc of Biden's work over the past 1 year or so. Almost everything he promised during his campaign, very little has been achieved. He promised a massive infrastructure deal. What came out was actually a pittance. He promised a massive measure in terms of social spending, what is called the Build Back Better bill. The Build Back Better bill is not, it's completely stalled because of the objections of the Republicans as a whole and 2 Democratic senators. He'd sort of promised this new culture, political culture in Washington, so to speak, where there would be more collaboration, where he'd bring people together to take the country forward. All that is completely fallen apart because we talked about in the past the 2 senators, Sinema and Manchin, who were able to block so much of policy. The Republicans have been together like a rock, being as obstructive as possible, furthering their right-wing agenda. We've seen, say, the redistricting of Congress, voting rights under attack. We've seen barely any progress in terms of racial justice, for instance, very little relief for the working people of America. And say even executive actions that Biden could have taken, for instance, eliminating student debt. Even those, the promises he made, nothing of that has been fulfilled. He withdrew from Afghanistan. That was a fiasco. Foreign policy-wise, hardly anything has changed. So what we actually see is a government in complete paralysis in various ways. And what Biden promises not only been not achieved, in many ways there's actually been a decline as well.
Right.
So this is actually a very bad signs for the Democrats as they go into October for the midterm elections. What it does look like is that they might lose control of the Senate, definitely. But the question of even the House of Representatives comes in. Once you see Biden lose, once the Democrats lose that election, we are looking at a lame duck presidency. For the rest of the time, Biden will barely be able to get anything done at all. So this, I think, fundamentally brings out the contradictions or the problems in the US politics itself right now, because it is basically an entirely corporate run. They're calling it a democracy is maybe a bit of a stretch. It's an entirely corporate run system. Massive donations to politicians, which have actually led to these positions they're taking. And we have a president who's barely able to get anything done. So not at all surprising.
And it also comes at a time on both sides of the Atlantic when governments have done very poorly in dealing with major global health crisis. What can either of these 2 leaders do to turn things around, actually, particularly Biden?
Actually, I don't think there's really much that he can do because, Biden's antecedents were always very clear. Biden came from the Democratic Party as a democratic establishment solution or alternative to Bernie Sanders, who was promising a bit more of a radical agenda, right? And Biden was clearly brought in as a man to protect the establishment, to make sure the boat is not rocked too much, for instance. And so it was, for many observers, it was clear from the very beginning that all he was going to bring was more of the same. So I really don't think that there is actually much he can do. I mean, he will do. What he can do, there's actually a lot. Like I said, there's a lot of scope when it comes to executive action. Many critics, especially in the left, have argued that Biden has failed to use the presidency as what is called a pulpit, where you go out to the people, bring out these contradictions. He's failed to do anything of that. He's gone with this whole idea that you can convince certain politicians or the Republicans or say certain Democratic senators about what to do. All that has obviously not been the case. So he's not taken any of these issues to the people. He's not sought to address say the people who were the most affected. And if you look at many of his speeches, for instance, very anodyne, there's no other way to describe it. So keeping all this in mind, there's actually a very limited set of possibilities in terms of what he can do. The only possibility, which is what the Democrats are doing, is time and again raising the specter of the Republican revival, which is definitely happening. There's no doubt about it, because the Republicans are very, they're very charged up, they're very enthusiastic, and they have this idea in mind that they're coming back in October. So there is actually very little. So that's the only funding, not only in terms of funding, but even in terms of mobilization, that is the only argument that the Democrats are able to present, that we are better than the Republicans, as opposed to bringing about any kind of structural change at all. And I think probably one of the best examples of this is the fact that the Democrats are not being able to do anything, while voting, voting restrictions are being put in place, which is probably destroy or delay the possibility of any kind of democratic comeback for a quite long time. The fact that Republican states are able to do this and nothing is being done on the ground, there's no possibility of a mass mobilization, for instance, shows the fact that the Democrats are basically in a really, really bad shape, and they're basically presiding, or they're watching as and it's important again to note that they were in the presidency, they had control of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Despite that, they're just watching or sitting by as their
Things
own party
apart.
is destroying. Exactly.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Prashant. Right, earlier in the week, we talked about the resumption of the 8th round of talks being held in Vienna to re-enter into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, more commonly referred to as the Iran nuclear deal. The 2015 deal fell apart when the US unilaterally withdrew under the Trump administration. Talks resumed after a week's break, during which time envoys returned to their respective capitals for political consultations. Prabir is with us now to talk a little more on what's been going on in Vienna since Tuesday. Prabir, what do you make of the latest round of talks? Are we heading towards a conclusive sort of set round of dialogue?
Because unless we are sitting there, that's a difficult call.
Yeah.
But from what we hear, that the both sides are close to a deal, it seems, or a revival of the deal. But at the same time, there are various reservations that are there on both sides, on what will be the future if they do bring back the deal. So, question was always the Iran sanctions, which the US had introduced post-2018 when Trump withdrew. They reimposed the sanctions, which they had earlier withdrawn as a consequence of the deal. So Iran had said you have to go to status quo ante, that means go back to those sanctions being lifted, otherwise there is nothing for us to discuss. And at that time, the US was really playing footsie with them, talking to them, but at the same time not willing to lift the sanctions. And Iran, at that point of time, decided to restart their nuclear enrichment program, which is what their pressure was on the United States. Either you have a deal or we go ahead with nuclear enrichment. And the enrichment levels have now come from 20% to 60%. And if we know what this technology is all about, then we know that with the improved centrifuges that they have now introduced, what is called the breakout time, how quickly they can reach 90% enrichment of a certain amount of nuclear fissile material, that has become shorter and shorter. So effectively, the idea that with the sanctions and the threat of further sanctions, they'll be able to stop Iran hasn't held.
Hasn't worked.
And that hasn't worked. And we can see very clearly that they have no other leverage now. Therefore, the only way they can get back to controlling Iran's fissile material output is by lifting the sanctions and with Iran's agreement. And therefore, the leverage they have, they've successively lost. That's where the situation is. So at the moment, if they agree to lift the sanctions, and that has to be not in word, but in deed. And indeed, last time, even after Trump came into power, and even at the time that Obama was a president, there was always a halting process of lifting sanctions. It was very slow, and it still had a lot of things in place, which they had agreed to lift. But the timetable was being dragged out, and of course, Trump threw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. So given that, I think what we are seeing is, yes, US finally realizes there is no other way except lifting sanctions, and it has to be good faith negotiations, and they have to agree to this. So the lifting of the sanctions. And Iran has agreed tacitly that if Biden is no longer the president, if new president comes, which it will might after 2024,
Yeah.
then of course the deal again would be in danger. Just like Trump took a sledgehammer to the deal, it could happen again. So I think both sides are working within that constraint.
Right. And what are, let's say we assume the best possible scenario in this case and they do reach an agreement, what are the implications then for the region?
See, one of the major issues is the joker in the pack, Israel.
Yeah.
Now, they have been sabotaging Iran's nuclear processes, their facilities, killing of scientists, assassinations, all these things have been going on. And they have been saying that fairly openly, that they will not rest, they will continue to take action against the Iranian nuclear facilities, whatever they're doing. And if US doesn't take them out to military action, they reserve the right to take military action. All of that is very dangerous for the region,
Yeah.
because if there is an Israeli attack of the kind that might happen, they don't really have the ability to destroy Iran. That only the United States has. But they have the ability to start a war over there. And if Iran then retaliates, the Dibona nuclear facilities are there. There is obviously also the fertilizer, chemical industries, which are quite near Tel Aviv. All of them are at risk, and Israel is at risk. Yeah. So I don't really know what Israel means, but I think it's a blackmailing tactics against Iran, but more against US to keep the pressure on Iran. Otherwise, we might do all this kind of things. So we are the crazies in the region kind of scenario.
Right.
So I think that we have to see what happens there. Otherwise, what we would expect is a reorganization of the diplomacy of the region, and then the countries in the region talking to themselves to resolve the issue, and not going to Uncle Sam to come and either protect them or to put pressure on others, or be essentially the final arbiter of what happens in the region. I think that's already visible with Saudis, United Arab Emirates, Turkey, all of them talking to each other, even Israel, and Iran being very much a player in all of that. So I think things would improve if the deal comes back and we really have Iran back as a player in the region, rather than this kind of global hegemon as a class monitor, really controlling others, and in the interest of Israel, who is not seen to be a neutral player in the region anyway.
Building both the carrot and the stick also in that
Building
sense.
the carrot and the stick, and wielding the stick in favor of Israel, who is an outlier in the region and is a destabilizer also. So that's where it is.
Thanks very much for that update, Prabir. And finally, the number of civilians killed or injured in Yemen has almost doubled since UN human rights monitoring ended last October, new figures have shown. In the 4 months before the end of human rights monitoring, 823 civilians were injured or killed in the war. In the 4 months that followed, the figure nearly doubled to over 1,500. During the same period, there was an almost 40-fold increase in civilian casualties caused by airstrike. That's right, 40 times more casualties due to airstrikes. The UN Human Rights Council rejected the renewal of the group of eminent experts' mandate on Yemen last October. The group was the only international, independent and impartial mechanism to monitor human rights violations and other atrocities committed by all parties in the conflict. I spoke earlier to Abdul, who covers the region for People's Dispatch via video conference. Right, Abdul, so from the report, is there enough evidence from your perspective for the UN Human Rights Commission to perhaps consider once again reinstating that mandate for monitoring?
If you ask me, of course there is. If you see the data provided by not only the Norwegian Refugee Council, but other organizations also. For example, data for Yemen. They also talk about how in last 4 years, and particularly in the month December and January, the number of airstrikes have gone many times, around 39 times more than what they were before October. So, and not only that, most of these bombings are happening in civilian areas. Even the ground troops are indulging in different kinds of human rights violations, preventing the minimum human aid to reach to the needy people, and the child soldiers are deployed by one group or another. So these things have come. For example, UN also acknowledges that this January has been one of the worst months in the last 7 years of war in Yemen. So the number of casualties have been higher than the last 2 years combined together. So all these things are evidence enough. that Saudi Arabia and UAE have taken advantage to the fact that there is no international monitoring, there is no accountability, and hence they can do whatever they want to do. And the only thing that can happen is some slogans are shouting here and there. Nothing material will happen. So because there is no basically some kind of collection of the facts from the ground. That thing is not happening, and therefore they have taken it for basically a free hand they have got.
Operating
So I think there is
impunity, essentially doing whatever they like. Yeah.
Exactly. They know that nothing will happen.
Abdullah, I want to understand also the politics behind the end to this mandate that happened in October of 2021, and then leading on from there into what the international community really needs to do to address this crisis.
The vote in October was quite you can say polarized, and it was made to be like East versus the West. The resolution which was proposed by the Dutch was not endorsed by most of the third world countries, those who are the members of the Human Rights Council, for various reasons. They had the argument that it seems to be a balancing act. This group of eminent experts are doing some kind of balancing act, equating Houthis with Saudi Arabian aggression, which is not, of course, which is not true. They also had other apprehensions about it, primarily the fact that US and UK, which are the primary sponsors, primary weapon suppliers to Saudi Arabia-led coalition, cannot talk about a need of that kind of they cannot be the champions of human rights as well. So there were politics at the time, but also from the other angle also, if we see that Saudi Arabia used, though it is not a voting member of the Human Rights Council, used its money and other things to aggressively campaign for mobilizing countries to vote against the resolution. So all these things happen, and so the entire politics is quite dicey. But I still think instead of abolishing the mandate or terminating the mandate of the, despite all the problems of balancing and everything, there could have been attempt to reform the committee or to make it more foolproof with kind of shuffling of experts and so on and so forth. Instead of doing that, the abolition of this monitoring committee, this expert committee, was a complete, I think, a knee-jerk reaction to what happened. So I think there is a scope for reinstatement, and there is a scope of going beyond that. Involvement of International Criminal Court and other forums which can establish some kind of accountability is required in Yemen, because the ground situation in last 4 years, 5 years has really become worse. So for the people of Yemen, it is required that such kind of accountability is established.
And it's a simple step to also tell the people of Yemen that the international community has not forsaken them completely. Thanks so much for that, Abdul. That's all we have on Daily Debrief for today. From me and the entire People's Dispatch team, thank you very much for watching. For more on all of these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.